Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Bia Labate. Bia is an anthropologist who specialises in the study of psychoactive substances, drug policy, shamanism, ritual and religion. She has a Ph.D. in social anthropology from the State University of Campinas in her native Brazil, and is the author, co-author and co-editor of over 20 books, as well as many peer-reviewed articles. She's organised many important conferences in the psychedelic space, and is the founder and chief executive of the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines. She's also the public education and culture specialist at MAPS, and is an adjunct faculty member of the California Institute of Integral Studies. Today, we talk about many aspects of global psychedelic culture, with a particular focus on ayahuasca. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Bia Labate. Bia, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So maybe we can begin with how you came to work in the field of plant medicine.
Okay, well, I guess like many of us, my interests really come from firsthand experience. In one line, I tried sacred plants, and I feel really real blessings and learning and awe and gratitude, and that sort of sparkled my curiosity. And it was a natural process since I like to read, and I'm an anthropologist. And then, I get curious, started to read, started to research and talk to people. Next thing, I'm organizing a conference. So it was very organic since the whole beginning.
Right. And was it with ayahuasca? Is that the main medicine you worked with?
No, I when I was 20 years old, I did a big road trip backpacking around. I spent 1.5 years traveling. I was in Guatemala, Mexico, went all the way from Guatemala to Alaska by land, and then back to New York and to the Brazilian coast, did this big road trip, this big adventure, and sort of fell in love with Mexico. That for me as a Brazilian, we're really not taught to look too much to Latin America, but more towards Europe and the United States. So it was a big discovery for me to learn about Mexico. And when I was in Mexico, I visited Huautla de Jimenez, where I tried psilocybin mushrooms. It was truly epic. And I also had the chance to eat peyote in the desert in the region of San Luis Potosí, Viricuta, and Real de Catorce, and also tried LSD. So I had that whole array of things. They were really beautiful experiences. I was also visiting the ruins and dreaming about other worlds and other utopias and other societies and other times and other ways to be in the world. And everything seemed so part of this other larger reality, and looking at revisiting the way I have understood everything, and us being part of nature and the universe. It was really powerful and life-changing for me, that whole entire 1.5 years. Also traveling a lot in indigenous communities, just hanging out, basically. The creative time of doing nothing, the most creative and powerful thing we can do, nothing, just live. And so that, together with being young and so idealist and wanting to make a revolution, and that kind of purity that, your early 20s, you have this sort of open heart and just feeling everything was magical. I think it was also kind of safer to travel. It was already dangerous back then, but not as dangerous as now. And after that, I stayed 5 years without doing anything, just kind of really digesting that whole experience. And when I was 26, I encountered ayahuasca in Brazil.
Right. And was that through the Unio de Vegetal, the Ayahuasca Church?
Yeah, that was where I tried first. But then I went to Santo Daime, which is the other big Brazilian ayahuasca religion. And next thing, I traveled to Colombia and to Peru and tried ayahuasca among indigenous groups and mestizo settings, vegetalista. And then started this whole chapter, which has been a great part of my professional and spiritual personal trajectory since then.
Right. I'm really interested in what this situation is like in Brazil with these ayahuasca churches. Are they kind of, I mean, because it's completely legal, right? Ayahuasca, are they just very accessible and widely known?
Well, that's kind of a relative thing to say, right? Like they are very widely known in the circles that I hang out with, but I guess I am a little bit biased. Kind of, I don't really know a lot of people that have zero relationships to any of this. Uh, but yeah, it's still like if you think in terms of numbers, numerically, it's very minor, 0.001 something percent. But Brazil is a huge nation too, so even a very small percentage is a population of maybe 30, 40, 50,000 people. So there is a whole culture around ayahuasca in Brazil. There's lots of things. There's a huge musical culture, different people receiving different kinds of hymns or sacred songs or different rituals. Have the main churches, ayahuasca, the religions are Santo Daime, UDV, and Barquinha. And then you have also what I have called neo-ayahuasqueros, which is a kind of splinter, dissident transformation, morphing of those traditions as they arrive in big cities like São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Brasilia. They combined with multiple different social and cultural contexts, like all kinds of urban religiosities or yoga or therapies, Hinduist spirituality, arts, and created different kinds of combinations. So there is that whole culture. And since more or less like maybe mid 2000s, indigenous peoples started to go out from the Amazon and travel and offer rituals, have ceremonies in these big cities. And so people can also attend firsthand rituals with indigenous leaders. And so there is a big conversation every weekend. There's dozens of rituals and people go in different things. Some people are members of the churches, others founded their own lineage. And there's a big circulation of substances, objects, ritual songs, knowledge in these networks, these urban networks. And as an academic writer and researcher of the topic, I have been promoting knowledge and research around it. There's also this other universe, which is the universe of the researchers of those things. And that's a very rich universe. We normally gather in the Brazilian Anthropological Association biannual meetings, ABA, and we have working groups to talk about the substances. So like 20 years ago, the working groups were like 3-4 people. Today, we have 2 big working groups with like 20, 30 new research per year. And sometimes we reject papers and people because there's just too much. And so that's another thing. Or our recent book on sacred plants in the Americas that I did co-edited with my colleague Goulart. We launched it and we sold 1,000 copies just like that. Boom. This book was in 2019. My previous book on sacred plants was in 2004. So from 2004 to 2019, 15 years, or sorry, I'm confusing the dates. Perhaps it was 10 years. I can't remember. But anyway, it's grown. It's grown a lot. And the same thing exists in Mexico, where there is a huge network of people that attend TPs, different ayahuasca churches, hybrid peyote circuits, and so forth.
Right. And when was it that the ayahuasca churches emerged in Brazil? I have very little knowledge of how that process happened.
The first ayahuasca church is the Santo Daime by Mestre Irineu, so it's around the 30s. And then you have Barquinha and União do Vegetal around the 50s and 60s. And maybe they expanded to urban cities from the north, from the Amazon to the cities around late 70s, beginning of 80s. And then they expanded abroad, maybe in the 90s. And today you have Santo Daime and União do Vegetal all over the world, including here in the Bay Area where I'm currently living.
Right. And I think I first heard about them through America and, their being able to give ayahuasca in certain states as a kind of religious freedom protection. But yeah, so I guess in my mind, I wasn't sure if it was something that was a response to the drug war, but it sounds like this is a true piece of Brazilian culture that's been there since before the war on drugs began.
Yeah, this is definitely a true Brazilian phenomena. It combines, on the one side, of course, Amerindian shamanism. So this whole idea that the plants are spirits, that they have some kind of agency and they can teach you, communicate with you if you follow their diets and if you follow the teachings of these religions. So it's based on Amerindian shamanism. It also has some European esoterical influences from esoterical trends from 19th century in Europe, Spiritism and Catholicism, of course. Both of these churches are Christian. And also it combines elements of African religious elements. So Candomblé, Umbanda, which are very typical Brazilian adaptations of African religiosity, are also part of the base that forms these religions. And so these religions emerged in Brazil. They don't come as a product of counterculture or some kind of contemporary intellectual leftist artistic appreciation for drugs, but they are considered sacraments that were like riverine mestizo caboclo adaptations of indigenous practices, mixing with other forms of cultural and religious expressions from the Amazon, from the Northeast. And so they predate this. Of course, that when it arrives to the big cities, it calls a lot the attention of more upper middle class people and people with interest in drugs or in intellectuals or researchers, people from universities or artists, not the same rubber tappers and traditional riverine Amazon people. So it gets mixed in the big cities joined by middle-class liberal professionals and students and academics like myself. And then it gets mixed. And so it's very rich and unique phenomena, and it has been exported. And this is also super interesting.
Yeah, I was going to ask what your thoughts are on the kind of the global this global phenomenon of ayahuasca churches. Is it largely a positive thing in your eyes?
Yeah, well, whether it's positive or not, it's kind of we can sit and comment, while having a nice cappuccino. But this is happening, and it's kind of, I see more as my mission to try to understand and to analyze. On the one side, as this is my researcher hat, my anthropology Ph.D. hat, and my executive director, nonprofit leader and organizer, I see as part of our mission to promote harm reduction towards this expansion. So I don't really think whether, this is good or bad, but how can I understand it and how can I help gear this in ways that are positive? But yeah, a lot of colleagues are pretty orthodox and sort of against, critical and more purist. I am not among those people. I have benefited myself from drinking ayahuasca a lot, and I have deep respect for this beverage and these traditions and the peoples from where it originates, the lands from where it originates. And I think that there is a lot of real sincere religious interests. And I am personally quite amazed with foreigners that get interested in this aspect of Brazilian culture, and a lot of people learn the languages. They study Portuguese, they sing in Portuguese, they read the teachings in Portuguese. And so I think it's interesting. Brazil is exporting, we were colonized, and Christianity was put and established upon us. And now it's time to export our Amerindian Catholicized version of ayahuasca back to Europe and the United States, and sort of promote this inverse colonization. There's multiple aspects to it. I published a bunch of books and did a lot of research, so it's kind of hard to even know where to take it. But yeah, I think it's fascinating as a cultural phenomena, and how this combines with, it has this kind of core that is the traditions, and then it combines with local elements. And so it combines indefinitely and creatively with different things that happen in different areas. So I particularly have a lot of respect for foreigners that are trying to learn these traditions, and that trying to learn different culture, different language, and can coordinate, drinking this powerful beverage, and also maybe singing or meditating, concentrating, keeping it together during the experience. There's a whole protocol on how to behave in these rituals. Of course, there can be excesses or abuses, but in general, I see this with positive eyes, and I am eternally fascinated by seeing the multiple developments of what's going on.
Right. And do you see your role as an anthropologist as kind of documenting and trying to kind of understand those multiple cultural kind of things that are unfolding?
Yes, I have a lot of my research has been, so my master's was on what I call this neo-ayahuasqueros, the new uses of ayahuasca in urban centers in Brazil. Of course, this term can be put in brackets because the ayahuasca churches are new themselves, but I'm thinking of like the ayahuasca churches as this kind of mattress of the religious use in Brazil, independent of the more traditional and long-standing history of indigenous use. And this arrived in the big cities and combined into these multiple versions of religiosity. So that was my master's. And my Ph.D., it was called Ayahuasca Mamancuna Merci Beaucoup, about the internationalization and diversification of the Peruvian ayahuasca vegetalism. So that is about this phenomena of North Americans or Canadians, Europeans, Australians going to South America to drink ayahuasca on the one hand, and on the other hand, this phenomena of the itinerant shamans that go from South America to the so-called developed world and offer circles and sometimes travel from city to city. And this other universe that is this mixture of interest of science and activism, which is the field of psychedelic science, that mix a lot of research, scientific interest with personal interest, and people that are have a kind of relationship to this practices. Because a lot of people that are interested in drinking ayahuasca or things like that, they don't have often institutional spaces where they can share that interest. Like, if you're interested in gardening, you're going to go to the gardeners club or whatever. Where do you go if you're interested in ayahuasca? So a lot of this interest, the psychedelic conferences, the circuit of conferences, and this kind of psychedelic community, global virtual community, has worked as a sponge to receive a lot of the interest that exists in the community. And I in my PhD, I looked at this also as another setting, let's say, of this expansion. So you have the expansions of the circuits of people giving ayahuasca, both in Peru and abroad, but you also have the circuit of psychedelic science and this mix where, you know, people sometimes during the day present a lecture and then at night participate in a ritual. And you also have indigenous people joining the circuit, sometimes as authors, as presenters or organizers, you know, organizing a conference in Peru so people could go to this conference and also take this medicines. And then the scientific categories that we use to explain things start to migrate to the discourse of the people that practice those things. So both the people who offer and the people who offer the experiences or participate in them start to describe these experiences in terms of, you know, DMT or integration, or using terms that are exogenous to the traditional contexts. So it gets to be this mix where science and psychology also influence the narrative of shamans or religious leaders, religious practitioners. So my PhD was about that.
That's really interesting. And now a lot of your work is done through the Chacruna Institute, right? Can you tell people about what that is and the work you do there?
Yeah, so I am the executive director of the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines. I also work in the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, where I'm public education and cultural specialist. So it's two different angles to my life that I find kind of complementary, and I sort of find the Chacruna Institute a sister organization to MAPS and vice versa. So in my Chacruna hat, I am the executive director. It's kind of my dream, and we have a team of people supporting. The Chacruna is named, of course, you know, for those of you who don't know, it's a catch-all word for Psychotria viridis, which is the leaf of this bush that is also used to make ayahuasca. So it's a tribute to ayahuasca, to my love for ayahuasca, to the inspiration ayahuasca has been in my life. Ayahuasca, this great friend and ally and plant teacher. And so the Chacruna Institute is a very modest grassroots nonprofit struggling to survive in the expensive waters of the Bay Area and all the million new investors and startups and, you know, business people that are interested in the field of psychedelics these days. But yeah, we basically promote public education around psychedelic plant medicines, and then we try to create this bridge between the world of shamanism, indigenous people, ritual, ceremony, religion, and the field of psychedelic assisted therapy or psychedelic science. And on top of it, we are really focused on creating access, inclusion, diversity in the field of psychedelic science. So we try to give visibility to the voices that normally stay out of the conversation. So what are those voices? Indigenous people, Black people, people of color in general, women, queer people, people from the global South, the disciplines of humanities, so anthropology, political science, sociology, geography, history. We're trying to rewrite the narratives that the field of psychedelic science tells itself. It's like, I like to think that when we go to do therapy, we're trying to rewrite the story that we tell us about ourselves. So I think the Chacruna Institute is trying to do some kind of cultural therapy where we rewrite, you know, the stories that we tell about the psychedelic field to itself. So both internally to the psychedelic field, in terms of giving visibility to these voices that often are silenced or invisible, but also to the society at large, because we're really trying to promote the cultural legitimacy of these plants, traditions, and the people who brought them to us, and their lands and their culture and rights and everything. Because what happens is that a lot of people can try to, combat the drug war and all the evils associated to it, and that's legitimate and important, and we also do that. But it's beyond that. I mean, what the essence of the problem that exists around psychedelics is a moral problem, is a cultural problem. It's a cultural war. It's a war based on religious dogma, on moral views, puritanical views, that don't consider these substances legitimate and consider them either pathological or criminal or perversions or artificial or illusions. And so at the core of the drug war, there is a religious, moral, cultural problem. And that is something that we need to address. That is much harder to change than the concrete, let's say, consequences of the drug war. So it's a lot of people are focused on combating, like incarceration or the problem of drug adulteration, or the problem of how the drug war has justified ethnic wars or geographic occupation of other countries, and talk about financial issues or the drug cartels and all of that. But to talk about why we don't consider psychedelics or drugs as legitimate things, that's harder. And so we are working on this sphere of culture, of knowledge, of awareness, of education.
That's really interesting. I agree that the core issue is a cultural one. And to me, it seems like on the one side, the people who are against psychedelics, it's a psychology of fear and control, it seems to me. And ironically, perhaps the solution to that is psychedelic medicine. So the people who are I think maybe it's not a coincidence, the people who want to suppress it are the people who probably don't want to go anywhere near it themselves because they're afraid to face their own shadow material and actually engage in this process. And maybe that's why, the legitimacy of psychedelics making their way through the kind of clinical system hopefully will give us some foothold of legitimacy in that world. Do you think psychedelics could be the thing that changes the mind of people who are against psychedelics?
If psychedelics could change the mind of people, of those who are against psychedelics?
Yeah.
Well, I guess that's a kind of problem of the egg and the chicken, right? Like, well, if only they were not against psychedelics and could try psychedelics, then
Right.
I think, as you said, you mentioned fear and control. Yeah, that's true. And I think, but still it's like a kind of psychological explanation. People being afraid or wanting to control things and not lose control. I think it's even more than that. I think it's that, but it's not just that. It's like there is somewhere in our, moral codes and our cultural imprint that we are trained and teach to think that these things are not right. And sometimes when it's right, it's kind of funny or kind of childish or kind of a bit, naughty to talk about it. So those are the foundations, the moral foundations of prohibitionism. The idea that you shouldn't ingest anything, that you can't alter your body, that these things are external or artificials, or that they are creating just a feeling of empathy or vision or insight, but in fact it's just like a kind of trick or even just a real mistake or perversion and all of that. And I think at the core of that is really not understanding the role of the substances that have played in different cultures. And if you look to indigenous practices and the story of psychedelics and the deep, long history, these substances have been used as part of culture, actually as a central way to transmit culture from one generation to another. In many indigenous settings, if you look at the history of how the substances appeared, it's frequently intertwined with the history of how mankind appeared on Earth as well. So the myths of origin that tell us how man came to be, why we are alive and why do we exist, why we are human, are frequently kind of intermixed with the story of these substances. So they are central to humanity, and they are related to multiple spheres of life. They can be related to, obviously, religiosity, but also to healing, to all kinds of artistic expressions, or things like divination or hunting, or even warfare, to celebration, to socialization. So they are central part of society and central part of culture. And using those plants is not something of counterculture, or if you are rebellious, or if you want to go against culture, if you want to be different. But it's a lot, it has a central role in different civilizations. And it's also, used for children, of course, on different doses and with different modalities. But as you grow up to be older and to understand things, you delve deeper into these practices and participate together with the elders and learn how to be a good member of your community, and how to be a part of this interchange, this connection between men, different human beings, but not just between human beings, but also human beings and nature and the invisible world. So the relationship to non-humans, to the world of spirits, to the invisible world, to the world of ancestors, to the world beyond. So practicing these traditions is central to culture, is part of culture. It is how also culture moves around and is exchanged. And we have our kind of own versions of that. Of course, it's not the same, but what we're trying to show is that these things are part of culture. They're not anomalies or mistakens or perversions. And that's what I'm calling cultural legitimacy. And that's also why the work we're doing is kind of hard, because it's different if you say, to a potential donor or funder, I'm going to create 100 treatments for American veterans with PTSD. It's something very tangible. It's very concrete. It's a deliverable. But I'm going to work to create knowledge to help people rewrite the narrative that, drugs have a kind of demoniac, perverted origin. And I'm going to produce articles and conferences and events and gatherings, and I'm going to help advance an ethos and a sensitivity that these things are part of culture, that they have a legitimate existence, and they shouldn't be combated as such. So that's part of the challenge. And in general, biomedicine, that's not related to drugs only, but to everything. Biomedicine has more status and is kind of on the top of the scale compared to social sciences, which are considered, not real sciences, not serious or not objective enough. I can say that to a neuroscientist that probably appears to have a lot of interest in humanities. Thanks for having me, by the way, and for listening to anthropologists and not just wanting to figure neuroscientists in your show. But yeah, so I think the having a small nonprofit, grassroots nonprofit that is led by a Ph.D. in anthropology and is talking about this freaky things about sacred plants, indigenous people, tradition, ceremony, ritual, and also how we have to include everybody in the psychedelic renaissance. It's been a challenge, but at the same time, people love it. I feel there's a real hunger. There is such a hunger out there. It's a sea full of hungry fish that are circulating around us. We get so many requests per day, interviews, media, documentaries, PhD students, volunteers, people that want healing, people that are curious, people that are journalists, people that all kinds of needs, because understanding, talking, and having critical thinking and making reflections and having a philosophical mind is also a human need, right? We need to feed, we need to heal our bodies, but we also need food for the thought and the soul. And the work we do, I think, mixes a lot of those things, because people are looking for community, for places to exchange ideas around these topics. So in the current, with all this explosion in interest in psychedelics, I feel that the Chacruna Institute has become a kind of hub for the psychedelic community to also vent, exchange, and be a support to each other, and kind of help preserves the values and the foundations of this movement, because it's changing a lot.
Right. Yeah, and I completely agree that understanding culture is one of the most important aspects of what's going on in this field. And you mentioned that we're still in a time where there's this feeling that in the mainstream that psychedelics are immoral, or it's based in a tradition of thinking of them as kind of sinful, or, as you say, not legitimate. And to me, it seems like, I think people dogmatically say that kind of thing when they don't really have a good argument. When they don't really have a good argument, the evidence doesn't suggest that psychedelics are bad in any way, if used responsibly. So you have to just kind of say they're immoral, they're, just don't go near them. And I think the solution to that, as you say, is a cultural change. And as someone who's not in the humanities, I struggle. I want to see a cultural change, and I'm not really sure what levers we can pull to make that happen. Do you think communication is the main way we can get there, through doing what you're doing in terms of, as you say, just speaking about this stuff, writing about it, doing conferences? Is that the best mechanism you think we have?
Well, like everything, there's just not like one single action that we have to take. It's totally like multifactorial. It's like when an airplane falls, frequently they have those charts. It's like series of things that happened that caused that. So how can we produce change? I think it's not just one thing. It's going to be a lot of actions together. So I am a supporter of this medical movement. And in my job in MAPS, I am supportive of advancing clinical trials and advancing all the scientific research. I think that's important. And showing the therapeutic potentials and benefits has certainly been a huge way to advance the legitimacy of psychedelics. And that was the case with marijuana. So first helping show the medical potentials, and then extending to other uses. So the medical piece is one piece, and then I think this cultural piece is another one. And again, I was recently on a debate in Intelligence Square. It was, should psychedelics be legalized or not? And on one side, it was Rick Dobling from MAPS and I, and on the other, the ex-president of the American Psychiatrist Association, and a man that was like a drug czar from consultant to Bush, Obama, and Clinton. And this medical doctor, he kept on saying, there isn't evidence that these things help creativity. And people just say they got insights, they got better, but how can you prove that? How can you prove that really happened? There is no scientific research. There's not enough evidence. There's not enough data. How can I know that psychedelics help anybody be more creative? And I told him, did you try to Google it? Because it's kind of just like so ridiculous to want to think that only a scientific peer review article can prove anything. Like science is this and life is this. And so, this guy was constantly saying that there was not enough science, but he also kept on saying, well, but I'm not speaking just as an academic. I had a firsthand experience, and so I know what I'm talking about, and I had a good experience. So when the cameras were off, Rick had asked him, hey, how do you know that your experience, how was your experience? Can you tell us? And he said, oh yeah, it was very good and this and that. And then he said, well, how do you know that it was really good? Do you have a scientific paper to prove it? And that for me was that was a kind of juicy climax of the whole meeting. Because this claim that we need science to prove, it's also a bit ironic, because this idea of like clinical trials and placebo and double blind and all this gold standard science research, and you probably know this as a neuroscientist, this is like 30s and 40s, and it's geared towards new substances, like substances that we have no proof and that were emerging as new substances. So to try to apply the logic of this to substances that exist since immemorial times is really contradictory. Anyway, coming back to your question, I do think that if we keep on having conversations and having other perspectives that are beyond the medical, but they are just talking about, it's also not just how this heals us, but how this is part of our lives, our identities, our territories, our socialization, our spiritual path, our friendships, and have more and more spaces where these conversations can happen. I do think that it helps. We have the experience of an ex-DA agent who went to our conference, Psychedelic Liberty Summit, and he was completely fascinated, and he looked us up and he was in awe. He didn't know any of that. He didn't know any of these conversations. He was curious. He wanted to have readings and recommendations. And we also get, a lot of business people, because when we're talking about building bridges, we're also trying to educate these newcomers and the people that are, the new recent Michael Pollan arriving in the field kind of person. Michael Pollan's book and decided to get interest in this. And these people also look us up and we give them literature, and people enjoy reading and learning. And so, yes, it's a process. And a lot of topics that Chacruna has put on the forefront, they start to become multiplied. It's incredible. It's a great joy for us. For example, we created our conference, Queering Psychedelics. The overlap, the dialogues between the universe of queer, the queer movement and the psychedelic movement. So it looks kind of obvious, right? But nobody had done it in those terms before. And so, like, how did these things relate historically? How can psychedelics help queer people? What are the specific needs of queer people for psychedelic therapies? Or what are the specific gifts that queer people can bring for healing with psychedelics? And how do queer indigenous cultures have related to queer issues? We created this conference. After this conference, we've seen emerging dozens of queer integration circles around the US and even abroad. We've seen this being put in a bunch of more mainstream media articles. Now when they had the World Psychedelics Day, they had a queer panel. We were invited to curate panels on queer issues in a few different conferences. And this has been happening with a lot of topics that Chacruna has brought to the forefront. So queer issues, issues around commodification of psychedelics, issues around sexual abuse in ceremonies, issues around racial issues in psychedelics. We were talking about peyote conservation since like 2016, and this is a big topic now that more and more people are talking. So yes, I think for sure promoting conversations and publications and knowledge is a good thing. But then again, you know, I'm a kind of hippie. I'm an anthropologist, and you know, my worldview is my worldview. It's not shared by everybody.
Right. Yeah, and I think actually the first time I saw you speak was in 2019 at Breaking Convention, where you gave a talk on sexual abuse in the kind of ayahuasca world, and that's a topic I wanted to to talk to you about, because I think it's I guess important to get information out there. Like, what kind of advice would you give for people for kind of navigating this world if they're going to a retreat in South America? What should people be aware of?
Yeah, this is one of the products of Chacruna that I am more proud of. I recommend everybody read our sexual abuse awareness guidelines that is published on our website, chacruna.net. And this is these guidelines have been published, I think, maybe, I don't know if 10 languages or so. We translated it to a bunch of languages. We also have legal resources that accompanying them and give tips on legal issues or places to find support. And we also are doing a survey now about this topic and people experiencing some kind of sexual abuse. So I think, there are many tips to give, but basically to research where you're going and be sure of try to go with a friend and have credentials of the people that are involved. And I think, there's a lot of details. A lot of shamans have talked to women. It's not just men and women, but mostly, but it also happens on the other way around or between some genders. But this idea that to do healing, you have to be touched, or take your underwear off, this kind of thing doesn't exist. Also, a lot of healers have said things like, oh, if you don't do this, your healing is going to be interrupted and you're not going to be healed. Or also just talk women into doing all kinds of things because that would be part of their healing. And also this economy of favors exchanging, like if you're friends of the shaman and or the religious leader, you get certain privileges and you can have more status in the ritual and have a kind of higher influence in the group. So kind of seducing people with benefits related to sleeping or doing sexual favors. So there's a whole spectrum of things, from rape to just issues of consent. There's a large discussion on whether you can really consent, relationship between a shaman and a participant. How long should you wait to engage in that relationship? And another angle to this is to try to educate the shamans and the practitioners themselves, because that involves a lot of cross-cultural challenges. I have heard this over and over again. Like, for example, a local Amazonian healer will say, well, I didn't abuse her because she wanted. She said she wanted. So this idea of consent and this power differentials and this hierarchy that exists is something that is not often talked about. And so I recommend people read the guidelines and do your research.
Right. And then more generally with the phenomenon of ayahuasca tourism, I guess there's a lot we could talk about there. But I read a paper of yours where you were talking about the kind of the dieta, the kind of the dietary restrictions. Although I guess dieta can also refer to dieting plants, so that could be something different. But just the way that now, before going to an ayahuasca ceremony, you're supposed to avoid certain things like alcohol. And I think you opened the paper by talking about, I think it was like 100 years ago, a British anthropologist or someone who tried ayahuasca and was immediately given a kind of glass of alcohol as well by the indigenous community, and just kind of illustrating that this isn't something that's some ancient, phenomenon that's consistent across all practices. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that kind of whole area?
Yeah, this topic of dietas have really captured Westerners' imagination, and there's almost like this competition of who is better in following their diet, and endless disputes and forums on the internet about trying to see, can you eat banana, or can you eat orange, or can you have coffee, or this and that, and people have spent hours of their time trying to figure out that, and also trying to find biomedical roots to those explanations. So, according to this study, there's a logic on why you can't use salt because of this and that, or if you have this kind of cheese, there's tryptamines, and so yeah, we as anthropologists we try again to analyze this as social phenomena and to see the history behind it, and why do certain rules stick for some certain people and don't stick for others. And we also just invite a kind of bigger, wider critical thinking on the topic, which is different traditions have different diets as well. So it's not something that is like an universal truth, but it makes sense for certain groups. And we encourage people to think critically about it, but also to get informed. I think it's very important to be connected to some kind of group. These things are strong and powerful, and it's not something so recommendable for you to do on your solo flight. They're really a part of a collective experience. Of course, people that are part of groups and that are initiated and have a lot of experience, they might have personal experiences then, but that's completely different from somebody that has no experience trying to have an experience alone and making all the shots, So I think the important thing is to be connected to some kind of group and follow that group's lead, and try to make sure that this group is a solid group. It's also not just one single individual that is going around and doesn't have any community anywhere, is not based anywhere, and is just like a shaman that is traveling to offer experiences for foreigners. I think the main recommendation is really to ground this experience on a community, and look to the history of this community. And different communities have different ways of dealing with the experience. And that's my take as an anthropologist. If we're interviewing the leader of a certain group, he might tell you, well, that's the diet is this and that, and that's what you have to do. So that's not going to be my answer for you.
Right. And it's very interesting the way that these ceremonies that people can attend, there's an assumption of that they're the traditional way of doing things, but as you say with the diet, maybe that's not the case. But also I've done all my ceremonies with a Peruvian ayahuasquero who told me that in traditional use, at least in his Shipibo community, it's the shaman who drinks the ayahuasca, and the person who's coming to the shaman actually doesn't. And so I was surprised by that. and he said that's kind of changed as Westerners have come and they expect to be able to drink it themselves. Do you see this kind of disconnect between the traditional use and the modern way it's given to tourists?
Well, it is true that there are certain traditions that the shaman was the only one that drank, and then with the interest of foreigners, like our outsiders, because it's not just foreigners but locals that are not from the jungle, then others started to drink. But there are also other traditions where everybody drank. So that's again not an universal thing. I think there's certainly something very interesting about all of this. I like to think with the contrast of psychedelic assisted therapies, where this therapist gives the substance to the person, but he won't take it. So let's say you have three kinds of scenario. One, only the therapist will take, and the patient wouldn't take. The other is both the therapist and the patient take, and then the third one would be only the patient takes and the therapist doesn't take. So that's also kind of interesting. If you look from a kind of traditional lenses, it's a bit weird treatment where your doctor is not taking that together with you, because the idea is that, as I said before, these plants are spirits and they have agency. They somehow have intentionality, subjectivity, and they are deep inside like humans. They have their own culture, they have their own traditions, families, organization. And when you relate to these plants, and that's when you can get their teachings, and also they kind of, they're able to incorporate in you and their knowledge comes to you. So it's a kind of weird tradition where, the therapist wouldn't take the substance. Only the person that is the patient takes the substance. And yeah, again, I am an anthropologist. I'm not trying to be a healer. I'm not a psychedelic assisted therapist. But to me, I would feel much more comfortable going to a doctor that takes the substance than one that doesn't. Whether we could make this obligatory in the FDA, that's an entire different question. I'm talking just very abstract here in kind of, generic terms, philosophical terms.
Right. And you also mentioned peyote conservation. I'd be interested to hear what's going on in that area.
Yeah, peyote is probably one of the most contentious topics in the field, because it's a small cactus that is endogenous to the south of Texas and north of Mexico, so it only grows in certain parts of the world. And maybe for a peyote to grow fully well, it will take 30 years or so. You can have as soon as maybe 10 years, 7 years, but a whole peyote, 30 years. And it's a fragile species. It's classified both in US and Mexico as an endangered species, and also in the International Convention of substances of plants. I forgot the name, but anyway, there's a classification into levels of danger, like vulnerable, almost in extinction, and endangered or so. It's known to be in decline, and there's just simply more people eating peyote than peyote's natural ability to regenerate. Also, there's just a lot of land development that are happening in peyote land, such as big mining companies or oil or monocultures and aggressive extractivist practices that damage the land and kill peyote. So both due to a personal human reach and through non-mindful, aggressive, capitalist land exploitation. Between those two things, peyote is in real decline. And so there's a great concern about it. It's different than other species. There's this particularity that there is an issue of conservation. And now it became also an issue in the United States, as the Native American Church, through its main organizations, of representation, the Native American Church, the Native American Church of North America, there's like 4 major entities that represent the Native Americans in the US, have issued an open letter to the psychedelic movement, asking the psychedelic movement to pause and to listen, and asking the psychedelic movement to let the Native Americans lead the efforts of conservation and regulation of peyote in the United States, and making a claim for the rights of sovereignty and the rights to determine how to move the conversations forward with the government. So it has been a very, very dramatic, long battle around all of this. And now there's another chapter called the Plant Medicine Healing Alliance that is based in Portland, that is advancing the discussions around Measure 109 and 110, which regulated psychedelic assisted therapy for psilocybin in Oregon, and also decriminalization of all substances in Oregon. And so this group, I sit in the advisory board, is trying to advance a decriminalization in ways that are mindful to Native Americans and also Black and Indigenous people of color and LGBTQA individuals. And so it's very vibrant. There's a lot of things happening now in the United States in terms of decriminalization and conversations around conservation and access and all of that.
Right. Well, thanks so much for your time, Bia. Would you send people to the Chacruna website if they want to look into your work more?
Yeah, I would love if people could join our newsletter. We send it out every Monday. We also have different social media series. Almost every day of the week, we have a different social media series. We have our Women in Psychedelics series launch every Friday. We have a series on people of color making a difference in the field. We publish a lot of things on policy issues, on cultural issues, on conservation, on legal rights. I didn't talk much about our other branch, which is the Council for the Protection of Sacred Plants, and also our Racial Equity and Access Committee. We have been doing a lot of work. I would be honored if you sign our newsletter, follow us on social media. And we're also just always looking for partners, donors, funders. If you can donate to us, we're not selling anything. We're very modest nonprofit based in the Bay Area that is grassroots and trying to do work. Our articles are for free. We don't have any marketing materials in our articles. And so I invite everybody to support and participate in our community forums, which normally we do on Wednesdays. And yeah, I thank you for the space and for the interest in our work.
Yeah, great. And thank you again for your time.
Thank you, James.